aqui pela sua vice-presidente, professora Toda. É um momento muito especial e comovente receber a professora Susannah Heschel aqui. Eu gostaria de chamar a atenção para o título do nosso simpósio, que é Heschel, Teólogo, Poeta. Não podia ser melhor, adequado. Porque Heschel, além de dedicar sua obra a reflexões sobre o judaísmo hoje, ele também se tornou um representante da tradição poética judaica, da Europa Oriental, do Yiddish. E a gente pode verificar nessa obra poética dele o que ela sempre faz. A poesia que representa uma síntese da sua personalidade, da sua atividade, do seu pensamento, do seu modo de existir. Como se fosse um fecho para realmente uma síntese da sua experiência, desde os tempos europeus, da tradição racídica, e também a poesia que é a tradição filosófica judaica medieval, quando os poetas, os pensadores, os filósofos, todos eles eram também poetas, ou seja, poetas hebreus, e deixaram um marco na história da poesia europeia medieval e principalmente na história da língua e da poesia, da literatura hebraica judaica. A professora Susannah Heschel, doutora, é uma destacada intelectual estadunidense, escritora premiada e autora de obras sobre questões que abrangem desde temas especificamente judaicos até a relação entre as confissões religiosas na atualidade, antissemitismo, ética, mulher, judia e também cidadã do mundo. Doutora Heschel é filha do grande rabino, que de modo coerente foi tanto autor engajado como militante, que eu preciso chamar a atenção, pelos direitos civis dos Estados Unidos, ao lado de Martin Luther King, que eu considerava não somente um profeta, mas um grande profeta. Descendente de rabínicos e tal, que traz toda aquela tradição e também o pensamento contemporâneo dentro do judaísmo e da filosofia europeia e internacional. Eu gostaria de chamar a atenção aqui para um aspecto. Qualquer leitor que tenha um mínimo de conhecimento do debate talmúdico identificará as raízes de sua personalidade do rabino Heschel como ator do nosso tempo. Em 1940, o rabino Heschel estabeleceu os Estados Unidos, depois de escapar do nazismo na Europa. Tornou-se professor do DARMOUTH College, do Jewish Theological Seminary, nas linhas da reforma judaica e do movimento conservativo. Quer dizer, ele representava uma síntese que vem da ortodoxia com as vanguardas do pensamento judaico atual. Isso de uma forma brilhante. E completa sua inspiração em mencionados filósofos medievais da Espanha, Sefarad, que também eram poetas. E na poesia expressava a síntese de suas personalidades. Na poesia completa-se a síntese do pensamento filosófico, teológico, histórico e pessoal, síntese que se abre num leque multidimensional, como podemos ver no seguinte poema, que eu traduzi do inglês, e nos devolve a vida, a religiosidade, a experiência desse homem multidão. Neste poema, especialmente sintético, Abraham Joshua Heschel se apresenta na polivalência de sua atemporalidade. Deus me segue por todo lugar. Roda uma rede de olhares ao meu redor. Aquece minhas costas cegas como o sol. Deus me segue como uma floresta por todo lugar. Meus lábios, cheios de admiração, são totalmente sensíveis, mudos, feito criança que bobeia num antigo lugar sagrado. Deus me segue como um calafrio por todo lugar. A vontade em mim é de repouso. A demanda dentro de mim é ergue-te. Vê como visões proféticas são desprezadas nas ruas. Vagueio com meus delírios iguais a um segredo num longo corredor através do mundo. E algumas vezes eu vejo, no alto, sobre mim, a ausente face de Deus. Deus me segue pelos bondes, pelos cafés, e é somente com o fundo dos olhos que alguém pode ver. Como os segredos amadurecem, com as visões vêm a ser. Esse poema resume a experiência toda, me parece, do rabino, do poeta do homem, Heschel, que tinha uma consciência muito plena do seu papel e do seu compromisso com o judaísmo e com o homem, no sentido amplo, geral. Muito obrigado.
Certa vez, num documentário sobre Abraham Joshua Heschel, chamado Pray with My Legs, no qual a professora doutora Susannah Heschel dá vários depoimentos, ela, em certa altura, diz o seguinte, que muitas vezes a obra de Heschel foi mais bem entendida, ou mais bem aceita inicialmente no mundo católico, por exemplo, né, entre cristãos, do que no mundo judaico inicialmente. Porque algumas questões as quais Heschel se debruça são questões que no mundo cristão são também temas muito importantes. Então, é assim que um teólogo italiano, professor em Roma, né, chamado Giovanni Tangorra, entendendo muita coisa sobre a obra de Heschel, o chama num artigo de Il Teólogo Poeta. E foi deste artigo, né, o título deste artigo, que veio o título deste simpósio internacional. E eu tenho a impressão, como bem demonstrou o professor MOACIR AMANCIO, que essa ideia de teólogo poeta é uma tentativa, né, de abarcar a obra de Abraham Joshua Heschel, tão difícil de ser colocada numa caixa específica. Me lembro que Neil Gaiman, falando sobre Heschel, ele discute sobre o aspecto filosófico de sua obra. Mas aí no aspecto filosófico da obra de Heschel, vem então uma questão. Pode uma obra filosófica ser tão literariamente maravilhosa? Será que isso não é outra coisa? Será que esse texto, que além de informar, ainda nos inspira, será isso filosofia? Então ele percebia, como é que eu vou dizer, uma dificuldade de demarcar a obra de Heschel apenas como filosofia. Da mesma forma, eu diria, quando Tangorra percebe Heschel como filósofo, também ele percebe a dificuldade de demarcar sua obra apenas no campo da teologia, aliás, uma coisa complicada em termos judaicos também, mas isso é outra história. E então ele faz esse hífen, né? Ele diz teólogo, poeta. Como demonstrou o professor MOACIR AMANCIO agora na sua fala, e como amanhã o professor Isidoro Abramovich vai nos presentear, Heschel inicia sua obra como poeta. Mas iniciando sua obra como poeta, ele também nos mostra um outro lado que de algum modo vai além do mero intelectual acadêmico, que ele nunca quis ser. Né? Quando ele diz que ele não queria ficar na torre de cristal, né? Ele já dizia isso, que é um aspecto que no dia do teológico seminário não era muito bom para o Heschel, né? Que era esse aspecto místico de sua obra. Então Heschel é um teólogo, é um místico, é um filósofo, mas é alguém que também se preocupa em sair da torre de cristal e realizar aquilo que ele percebeu desde sua tese na Alemanha, Die Prophete, que depois virou The Prophets, espanhol, Los Profetas, publicado pelo Seminário Rabínico também, né? Em que ele tira como uma das lições mais importantes que esse Deus cheio de emoção, cheio de patos, ama e quer o bem do ser humano. E tudo que é apresentado como qualidade divina, como bem diz, aliás, escreve Levinas, os atributos divinos não são ditos no indicativo, mas antes no imperativo. Ou seja, se Deus ama o humano, nós devemos entregar este amor. Eu me lembro que no JTS, na época que eu e a Mônica estudamos lá, tinha um grupo de estudantes que criou uma ONG, né, para levar comida aos homeless em Nova York. Não sei, hoje em dia, mas na época tinha muito homeless, e o nome que eles colocaram era um nome muito, de alguma forma, inspirado, eu diria, em Heschel, em que era o seguinte: God loves, we deliver. Né? Deus ama, mas quem vai entregar esse amor? Essa é a nossa mitzvah. Né? O pensamento de Heschel, tão difícil de ser colocado numa única caixa, tem esse tom que o torna tão especialmente importante para este momento da civilização. Heschel nos fala da urgência do humano, de um Deus que ama o humano, mas sobretudo numa época de radical desumanização, que certamente ele viu durante sua juventude, no entreguerras, que ele sofreu, né, como diz a professora doutora Susannah Heschel, ele nunca parou de estar de luto pelo desaparecimento não só da sua família imediata, mas do mundo judaico da Europa Oriental, aonde ele cresceu. Heschel é produto de vários encontros, e é por isso que essa obra, que não cabe numa única definição, será apresentada aqui por nós nesses dias em 4 momentos temáticos. Agora, nesse momento, com a professora Susannah Heschel, o humanismo ético-religioso de Abraham Joshua Heschel. Hoje à tarde, Heschel e a Bíblia. Amanhã de manhã, com o professor Ernesto Iata, né? O Heschel e o pensamento rabínico. E, ao final, teremos Heschel e o diálogo interreligioso, e a nossa cereja, né? No bolo sempre tem uma cereja. Teremos o professor Isidoro Abramovich, lá de Potsdam, nos presenteando com alguns poemas de Heschel, não apenas em português, mas como eles soariam em Yiddish. Né? Isso vai ser uma tentativa nossa aqui, singela, de homenagear este que foi um dos mais importantes pensadores judeus, eu não diria só do século XX, mas desta modernidade tardia e em crise em que nós estamos vivendo. Susannah Heschel, além de ser uma pesquisadora, uma erudita, uma scholar em temas judaicos, tanto nos aspectos da questão feminista, da questão de gênero, né, quanto uma estudiosa do Holocausto, do judaísmo alemão, né, ela também, não só por ter convivido de uma maneira muito próxima, muito íntima com Abraham Joshua Heschel, mas ela também é uma conhecedora profunda da obra de seu pai. E aqui eu queria apontar o livro que ela editou, né? Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, né? Grandeza moral e audácia espiritual, uma coletânea, magnífica coletânea, de artigos de Abraham Joshua Heschel, aonde a gente é presenteado com esse calendoscópio de aspectos da obra deste grande homem. Então, com vocês, a professora doutora Susannah Heschel.
Thank you. Perhaps I should thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you. I assume everyone understands English. There is translation if you have an earphone, yes. I want to thank the university, the Jewish Studies program, Professor AMANCIO. Thank you for your very beautiful words about my father. And I thank you so much, Rabbi Leone, for inviting me here and for organizing this symposium. And it's good to be with Rabbi Ernesto from Buenos Aires as well, and to meet some of you here in this Jewish community. I am deeply moved by the appreciation for my father here in Brazil. And I have to say that this tells me something about you as people of Brazil, that you understand and appreciate my father, that you are moved by his words, because I think there are two kinds of people in the world: people who understand, who are moved by my father, and people who have not yet understood, and in a sense haven't yet understood themselves and what it is to be a human being, and all the depth that my father discusses. My father had incomparable breadth and understanding of Judaism in a way that is really remarkable. He wrote books on every aspect of Judaism, on the Bible, on rabbinics, medieval philosophy, medieval Kabbalah, on Hasidism, modern Jewish thought, philosophy, ethics. It's extraordinary what he was able to cover. One person who knew so much, more than any other modern Jewish thinker. He was immersed in Jewish texts. And in fact, to understand him means to have an understanding also of the Judaism that shaped my father. But it's more than that. He also changes how we read, what we read, how we think, what questions we ask. In so many ways, he turns our thinking upside down. Suddenly there's a new way of thinking, new questions to ask. And that's remarkable. When he was still a young man, he wrote a small book about the medieval Jewish philosopher Saadia Gaon. And in that book, called The Quest for Certainty in Saadia, he begins by saying that scholars should not simply try to understand a philosophical argument in a text, but rather to understand the text as a window to the author's soul. He did that with Saadia. He did that with his study of Maimonides, with the small book he wrote on Abravanel. He did that with Judaism. What is the soul of Judaism? And so he says, Saadia, for instance, a great philosopher, Saadia did not write philosophy just to be clever or to dispel doubts. Rather, Saadia had inner quandaries, inner troubles. He wasn't sure, for instance, if he could really believe in resurrection of the dead, Tchias HaMesim. Saadia's philosophy, he says, was a personal quest. After all, he said, Saadia lived in an era in which there were crossroads of East and West, of Islam, of Judaism, of Persian influences. So many different claims. My father was very similar. And what he wrote about Saadia, we could say about him as well. What he writes is a window to his soul. And you know, many people tell me that when they read my father's work, they feel very close to him. So often they tell me they read his work and they have the feeling that he understands them. He understands their problem, that he is speaking to us when we read his work. And I think that's because my father creates intimacy in his writings. He's intimate with the text that he writes about, but he's also intimate with the people that he knows will read his work. Because as he wrote, he had in his mind his readers. I think also that the intimacy comes because my father had an extraordinary sensitivity to the difficulties that human beings have, all of us, in our lives. He had difficulties too. And I will tell you that he was never shy about listening to other people's problems. People would come to him, he would listen. He never cut anyone off. He never turned away, no matter how terrible the trouble was. I felt always that I could talk to him about anything, and he listened. There's an intimacy that he had that comes from Hasidism, that comes from the Hasidic understanding of what it means to be a rabbi, to be a rebbe, a Hasidic rebbe. What is it to be a rebbe that's different from being a rabbi? And there's a story that my father used to tell me often, and that he mentions also in his writings. It's about the Abertura Avram Yeshua Heschel, the person for whom my father was named, who lived in Ukraine in the early 19th century. Maybe you know this story, you've read my father's work. People would come to the Abertura, he lived at the end in Mezhbish, they would come to him all day, one after another, and they would tell him their problems and ask him to pray for them, for a sick child, to get a job. Think about poverty, sickness. And one day his assistant asked him, how do you remember all of these people who come to you? And the Abertura answered and said, when someone comes to me and they tell me their problems, I open my heart and I let all of their sorrows come inside my heart and they make a scar in my heart. And when I go to pray, I open my heart to God and I say, look at all these scars. And I think that tells us something about what it is, first of all, to be a rebbe, to listen to people in a way that their problems come and make a scar in our heart. That's what it is, really what I think we all want to be listened to in that way, or to have the capacity to listen to other people in that way. And my father was that kind of person. And that kind of intimacy, that resonance to other people, that, for my father, that is what Hasidism is about. That's the soul of Judaism. And it's the soul of every human being if we let it be. It's an intimacy. It's also what kavanah means, about devotion to God. Intimacy like that. To be listened to by God, but also from my father. that we can listen to God in that way. Because prayer is not simply how we speak. God also prays, and I'll come to that in a moment. My father used to say that he grew up surrounded by people of religious nobility. Religious nobility, which I think is an amazing phrase, religious nobility. It's hard, I think, for us to imagine what it would mean today to raise our children in an atmosphere of religious nobility. My father was the youngest. He was a mischievous child. He studied all the time. He didn't play games. But his older sisters would tease him. They adored him. He was adorable. When he finally had a child, I'm an only child, my father had a chance to play games for the first time in his life. And he had great pleasure in experiencing through me vicariously a bit of childhood, fun and play. But my father was only 9 years old when his father died. And that scarred him, that left him with a longing that he told me always he wished he could talk to his father once again. My grandmother was very poor, and my father grew up in poverty and understood what it meant. His hands were permanently swollen. They had been frostbitten so many times. When my father lived as a student in Berlin, he was very poor. He subsisted on potatoes for many, many years. But he studied constantly, all his life, day and night. My father was never without a book, always. My father didn't believe in entertainment. He did believe in celebration, and he knew how to celebrate. When there was a special occasion, my father created an atmosphere of celebration. But entertainment was passive, and my father wanted to be engaged all the time, engaged with people, with ideas, so he was reading and thinking and writing. I want to say a word about his doctoral dissertation, which he finished in December 1932 at the University of Berlin. It's a unique book because he took on German Protestant biblical scholarship, and he criticized it severely in a way that he never did after that. But it's a very severe criticism of how Bible scholars fail to understand the Bible. I'll give you an example. My father told me that he went to a class one day and they were studying the prophet Isaiah. And this was a class at the Reform Rabbinical School taught by a Jewish professor, but with the same mentality of biblical scholarship. And you know Isaiah says, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort ye my people. Beautiful. But the professor said, this is a mistake. The scribe writing down the words wrote down Nachamu, comfort ye, and then he must have been distracted. He turned away, and he came back, and he forgot that he wrote down Nachamu, so he wrote it again, Nachamu. And so he took his pen, the professor, and crossed it out. It's a mistake. A scribal error. My father told this as an example of the absence of any sense of the poetry, of the text, the beauty, and the way the Bible speaks to us. Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. the voice is missing when you cross it out. Scholars don't understand. And so, about the prophets, there's a long tradition, begins really in the 1890s in Germany, of Protestant Bible scholars who said that the prophets, we go like this in America, I don't know if you do this here, the prophets were a little bit off, yeah? Not quite normal. What did they do? They fell on the ground, they were ecstatic, they lost consciousness, they didn't know what they were saying. Now, there was a tradition of Jewish thought in the modern period that said that the prophets had a message, the message of justice, the message of God. They called it ethical monotheism. But it was very dry, that message. So my father's critique was directed against the Protestants and against the Jews, and said we have to find another way to understand the prophets. So his dissertation was a sharp critique of really all that had been written about the prophets until that point, and instead a presentation of Jewish understanding. What are Jewish understandings of the prophets? And here my father drew on an old rabbinic expression, idea, tzorach gavoha, which means a divine need, that God needs us. Tzorach gavoha. And this, my father called divine pathos. His point is that we can't read the Bible with the terminology of Aristotle, of divine omnipotence, of divine omniscience, because the Bible understands God differently, that God needs us, that God responds to us, that God is resonant to human beings. Now, that dissertation was finally published a few years later by the Polish Academy of Arts and Letters, so that my father could receive his PhD. It was already the time of Hitler, and my father was trying to leave Germany. There was a possibility of a rabbinical school in Prague. Didn't happen. My father was deported with all the Polish Jews from Germany in October 1938. Then came Kristallnacht. My father was in Warsaw with his mother and sisters. And then at the last minute, he said, as a brand plucked from the fire, he received a visa to come to the United States, thanks to the president of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Julian Morgenstern. My father spent the war years in Cincinnati, trying to save his mother, his sisters, his extended family, and friends. He was alone. He lived in a room in the dormitory. He had a little refrigerator because he couldn't eat the food in the cafeteria. It wasn't kosher. It was a Reform seminary. And then after the war, he moved to New York City. He met my mother, and he started writing one book after another in English. And in a very short time, in just a few years, he published one book after another. It was amazing. Now, I would say that my father's work is as dramatic, let's say, as that of Freud. Changes the way we think entirely about what it is to be a human being. It's also a radical break with Jewish thought. And I want to give you some examples. One of my father's most important books, and a book that he loved more than any other, was the book that he wrote in Hebrew, Torah min hashamayim v'es bagloria shel hadarot, which was just reissued in Israel in 3 volumes. It was a book that he loved writing, and he wrote actually in a very short period of time because he knew all the sources in his head. And that's why there are some errors in the footnotes, the wrong page. Maybe he didn't remember the page number, but he remembered the text. But it's a book about rabbinic thought. Now look, usually when Jews study Talmud, they read the legal parts and they skip the passages that are stories or that have a little moral statement. They skip it. It's called Agadah. But my father says, no, it's in the Agadah portions of the Talmud where we find Jewish theology. Jewish theology, people used to say all the time, there is no such thing. No such thing as Jewish theology. I used to hear this growing up as a child. My father called himself a Jewish theologian, and then people said, there is no such thing. It was confusing to me as a child sometimes. But for my father, these passages of Jewish theology were of profound importance. He recovered them for us. He writes, a major root of the tragedy in our living by halakha, by Jewish law, lies in our detachment from the intellectual, moral, and spiritual teachings of Judaism. And yet at the same time, he's not saying we give up halakha. He says to give up halakha would be spiritual suicide, he says. Halakha, however, is not the central issue of this generation. And this is something that my father asked himself. He survived. 6 million were killed, including his mother, his sisters. And he asked himself, what is the mandate for my life? There was one time as a child I was doing my homework, and I suddenly thought to myself, I have a life. It's mine. I can do anything. I can study anything. I can travel. I can go anywhere. I have my life. And I immediately went to tell my father with great excitement, I have a life. And my father said to me, yes, but what will you do with it? Life is not a gift, he wrote. It's a mandate. And my father felt that very much after the war. His writing changed, his topics changed, because he asked himself, what is my mandate? What does the world need from me right now? What do the Jews need from me? But what does the whole world need from me right now? Why was I saved? For what purpose? For one thing, my father felt it was very important for Judaism to move outward, but also to let the world in, not to live in an enclosed way. You know, Walter Benjamin spoke of writing as a writing of the ruin, rescuing the luminous fragments of life. And my father, I think, rescued what is luminous in Judaism. What is luminous? He writes in The Earth is the Lord's, Judaism is the least understood religion in the world. And that's what he wanted to do, to give us Judaism, to give it back to Jews, but to give it to the whole world. Because he felt already as a student in Berlin, these Bible professors, great professors of religion, that they had much to learn from Judaism. They didn't understand religion. With all of their theories of holiness, they had never experienced it. They didn't know. At the same time, my father saw what happened in those days in the war as a collapse of Western civilization. And now, he said, what we have is the afterlife. We're living in the afterlife, he said. indifference, he said, that's the trauma. He said in a Yiddish speech once, I often sit and wonder, perhaps our souls went up in flames along with their bodies in Majdanek and in Auschwitz. Perhaps we need someone to recite Kaddish over us, for us, because we have lost our souls. Kaddish over us for our indifference. And yet, at the same time, he said, melancholy would be moral cowardice. We cannot sit immersed in our trauma. Moral cowardice. The opposite of good, he wrote, is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference. To sit in the trauma, to sit in the afterlife, and make it a trauma of personal suffering is moral cowardice. There were in those days two paths in the United States among the Jews. There was the path of Meir Kahane, who said, never again to the Jews. And there was the path of my father, who said, never again to any human being. It was my father alone who said over and over, Auschwitz and Hiroshima. You don't find that in other Jewish thinkers in that era. There are some scholars who answer questions, and there are extraordinary scholars who give us new ways of thinking. Some like to reconcile conflicting views. Some like to smooth over problems. One of the most influential books in my father's lifetime was written by Ephraim Urbach, a professor at Hebrew University, called Chazal, The Sages in English, a book about rabbinic thought, in which Urbach tried to show that the rabbis had the same ideas, ultimately, as Plato and the Greek philosophers. All the same, just as good. Something you don't find in my father is apologetics. He never tries to say that Jews are just as good as Greeks. He says Judaism is different. We have a different path, a different way of thinking. He was different also from other modern Jewish thinkers in the way he wrote about Christianity. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think one of the most extraordinary elements for my father and his work, and there's so many, but one of the most extraordinary is what he writes about prayer. You know, there is a passage in the Talmud, in Masechet Sukkot, that my father quotes in his book Torah Ben Hashemayim, where it says, as we know at the end of Sukkot, on Hoshana Rabbah, we say, Ana Hashem Moshiana, God, you should redeem us. And it also says, Ani v'ho Hoshiana. Ani v'ho Hoshiana. I and Ho should be redeemed. What is Ho? It says in the Masechet Shabbos, Ho is the Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's God. We say on Hoshana Rabbah, in our liturgy, in the Talmud, God, may you redeem us, and may you too be redeemed. It's one of the central ideas that my father develops throughout his writings. What does it mean that God needs redemption? Who ever heard of such an idea? Certainly not Plato and Aristotle. God is all-powerful. Judaism has another perspective, And it's not only the perspective in medieval Kabbalah, it's in medieval mysticism, in the Zohar, yes, but it's in the rabbinic literature as well. It's in the Torah, in the Bible, in the prophetic writings. God needs redemption. What does that mean? My father interprets the words of the Kaddish, Yiskadal v'yiskadash me rabba, may God's presence be expanded in our world. But how is God's presence to be expanded? Certainly not through moral cowardice, not by sitting in our trauma, not by revenge for what happened to us, not by focusing on anti-Semitism. No. How do we expand God's presence in this world? My father went to Selma. My father spoke out against the Korean War. My father was involved in the Second Vatican Council. My father spoke out on behalf of Soviet Jews. My father spoke out against nuclear weapons. And by the way, my father also spoke out for the legalization of abortion. My father did these things to expand the presence of God in this world. What does it mean, God needs redemption? Redemption from what? Redemption, one thing my father writes in the epigram to Torah Ben Hashemayim. Redemption from human narrow-mindedness, from small-mindedness, from literal-mindedness, from scholars who say the second Nachamu should be crossed out, from people who have no sense of poetry. When my father went to a meeting, my school, my elementary school, when I was in the 4th grade, and they had a meeting with the parents and the teachers explained what they were going to teach this year, and my father said, "Can you also teach poetry?" Why poetry? Because poetry is the beginning of prayer, he says. To have sensitivity to poetry is the beginning to stir the soul. And prayer is the home of the soul. That's where our soul finds its home. And that's where we find our own soul, in prayer. Prayer, he says, should be subversive. Subversive, you know, in those days, to use the word subversive, that was the word associated with hippies, with rebels. It's not a word that a Jewish theologian used, but he did it deliberately. What is subversive? He said, you don't walk out of the synagogue and pat yourself on the back and say, I'm such a good person, I went to the synagogue today. First of all, he said, a religious person can never say, I am a good person. Because a religious person is never satisfied, but always dissatisfied in saying, I need to do more. I need to work harder, pray harder, think more deeply, be more sensitive. So prayer should shake us up, make us ask ourselves, how am I living? What kind of life is this? Where is my mandate? So, he says, it's human narrow-mindedness that causes the exile of the Shekhinah, of God's presence. Narrow-mindedness, passivity, moral cowardice, entertainment. Now, at the same time, my father urged all of us, in a Hasidic way, that Judaism, our religious expression, has to be authentic to who we are. He takes this from the Kotzker Rebbe, whom he wrote a book about in Yiddish, my father's last book. And the Kotzker says, you can't be Jewish just like you can't wear someone else's shoes. My father says too, Judaism has to be authentic to who you are. You can't be Jewish just like your grandparents to imitate others, because that, he writes, that would be spiritual plagiarism. Spiritual plagiarism. A major issue for us today. Spiritual plagiarism. Yes, it's nostalgic sometimes to be Jewish like our great-grandparents were in Poland in the 19th century, to wear the clothing and so on. Is that really the mandate for today? Is that what Judaism has to offer the world? Because Judaism ultimately has a mandate too. Rescued from the war. So we can't be Jewish like everyone else, and my father was inherently pluralistic. There must be many ways of being Jewish and many ways of being religious. He said in an interview, you wouldn't go into a museum. Imagine you go in and all the paintings are identical. Every painting is unique. Every person is unique. Every face is unique. And so too religiously. He gives us new ways of thinking about being religious, but he tells us you have to begin by knowing who you are. If your Judaism is to be authentic. Who am I? Who am I? That's the main question that Hasidic Rebbes would ask. Who is this person, this unique individual? Religion, my father said, cannot be reduced to the categories of sociology and psychology. We need our own categories, our own ways of thinking. And by the way, the philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, the German philosopher of the 19th century, was famous for saying that God is a human projection. And at the end of his life, he said, if you want to understand religion, you have to talk to religious people. Feuerbach recognized that. Understand how religious people experience being religious. You know, after the war, there were many Jews who turned away from Judaism. There was a belief in America that orthodoxy was over. Finished, no more. No one would be Orthodox. Maybe there are a few people left, they'll die out. A lot of people said after the war, I can't believe in God. How can I believe in God? God is dead. My father said no. He writes that the sense of God's absence confronts us with our craving for submission. A craving to abdicate our responsibility, transferring that responsibility to God. Now that's unusual for a religious person to say that. We human beings have a craving for submission. But I think it's true. A craving for submission to fascist leaders, Hitler, to leaders of cults like Donald Trump. You have one here too. It's all over the world. A craving to submit to a leader. But you know it's unusual for someone who believes in halakha and Jewish observance, Jewish law, to speak this way. We're supposed to submit to the law, no? Jewish law. No, my father says. That becomes a craving to abdicate our responsibility, to transfer our responsibility to God. To say that God doesn't exist after the war, that's to transfer our responsibility to God. Judaism, he says, is a cure of the human condition that comes not through the submission to authority, but through its subversion, the power of knowing God's presence that undermines that submission and transfers to human beings the power that is ours. Don't submit We have responsibility. Yes, we would like to submit. And sometimes being Orthodox, being Haredi, it's a submission. Just like saying God doesn't exist. That's a submission, an abdication of our responsibility. It's saying it's God's fault. There are some who say that theology is a melancholic science, a work of mourning. My father says, melancholia is moral cowardice, an inability to ethically face up to the demands of the day. The demands of the day, the demands that we stop with this racism, that it is impossible for a Jew to live as a Jew in a racist society and do nothing about it. I cannot go to the synagogue and pray, my father said, and at the same time support that my government drops bombs on Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, and drops napalm on children. Look at this world. We thought it was bad in 1939, now look what's going on in this world, all around. My father once went to a demonstration against the war in Vietnam, and a journalist said to him, "What are you doing here?" My father said, "I'm here because I can't pray." And the journalist said, "What do you mean you can't pray, so you go to a demonstration?" My father said, "When I open the prayer book, I see before me children burning from napalm. How can I pray? How can I have the right to pray? How do I have the dignity to stand before God when my human beings, fellow human beings, are doing this to other people, torturing human beings? And I, as a human being, stand before God and pray, and I ask God, give me redemption? Look what I'm doing." I pray, my father writes, I pray because I am unable to pray. And suddenly I am forced to do what I seem unable to do. But my father said, callousness is not immortal. Sometimes there can be an end to callousness, sometime in the future. And one way is through prayer, to break through the callousness. My father writes, some souls are born with a scar. Others are endowed with anesthesia. Satisfaction with the world, he writes, is the ultimate callousness. Satisfaction with the world is callousness. The irreconcilable opposites which agonize human existence are the outcry, the prayer. That's the prayer. Here's an example of a text from the Talmud, from Brachot, page 7a. Rabbi Yochanan says, in the name of Rabbi Yossi, how do we know that God prays? We know from the verse from Isaiah, I will bring them to my sacred mountain and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. And the Talmud then says, it doesn't say their house of prayer, it says my house of prayer. And we learn from this that God prays, my house of prayer, God's house of prayer. But then, what is God's prayer? Rabbi Zutra Bartovia said in the name of Rav, here is God's prayer. May it be my will compassion subdues my anger, and that my mercy overcomes my other attributes, that I may deal compassionately with my children and meet them beyond the line of strict justice. That's remarkable prayer. This is how God prays. Prays for compassion, for mercy. Prayer then becomes what some like to call imitatio Dei, an imitation of God, being God-like to enter prayer. But prayer is not just words, and it's not just a moment. It's not just in the synagogue. Prayer becomes life itself. When my father went to Selma, Alabama, to march in 1965, it was a march for voting rights, the basic right of citizenship for Black Americans, a right that has now been eroded by Chief Justice John Roberts of the Supreme Court in the United States, further eroded by the Republican-controlled state legislatures in the United States, which is, let me just translate that, it is a way of removing, denying, eradicating citizenship from Black Americans. Citizenship that only came late in the 19th century, and they now want to take it away. Not to be able to vote is to be told you are not a citizen of the country. Just to be clear about that. That's what's going on. That's what Trump is doing. That's what the Republican Party is doing in the United States. Just to be clear, some can be citizens, some cannot. And that includes, by the way, in addition, people who are disabled. So, my father went to Selma, and in that march was the third attempt of a march from Selma to Montgomery. The President of the United States then, Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, supported the march and sent federal troops to protect the marchers. I remember it vividly. It came at the last minute, these federal troops of protection. And my father received a telegram on Friday afternoon asking him to come to Selma on Sunday to march from Dr. King. And it was a very nervous Shabbat for us. At the end of Shabbat, when we made Havdalah, the prayer at the end of the Sabbath, and we went downstairs, my mother and my father and I, in the elevator. We lived on the 8th floor. We went down, we went outside, and there came a taxi to take my father to the airport. And he bent down and he kissed me goodbye, and I held on to that moment because I thought he might not come back, and that might be the last kiss I received from him. And when he came back from Selma, he said, I felt my legs were praying. Because to march for justice is also to pray. Now, my father said, and I hope I haven't spoken too long for you. We're to come to it. One of the things my father used to often say in his lectures, if you want to know God, sharpen your sense of the human. Sharpen your sense of the human. It actually echoes a medieval 13th century commentary of Bachya ben Asher, Rabbeinu Bachya, not Bachya ben Pekuda, but Rabbeinu Bachya's commentary. It's a commentary he wrote on a passage from the book of Genesis, the very beginning of it. And he says there, "Know your souls, and you will also know your God." In a sense, it's like saying, know yourself. Be authentic to who you are. And what's interesting is that it's similar to a hadith that was quoted by Sufis, in which the Prophet Muhammad says, "He who knows himself knows his Lord." You know yourself, you know God. You want to know God? Sharpen your sense of the human. God prays for compassion, for mercy. Why? Mercy on us, compassion for us. God prays for us, for our well-being. And that too is intimacy. A Hasidic Rebbe, Pinchas of Koritz, taught that prayer itself is God. Prayer is God, he says. And my father writes in one of his essays, the issue of prayer is not prayer, the issue of prayer is God. He says there is something which is far greater than my desire to pray, namely, God's desire that I pray. God's desire that I pray. It's an extraordinary sentence that our prayer fulfills God's desire. But it is, in a sense, the leitmotif of my father's writings, that God is in search of us, that God needs us, tzorach gavoha, that this is what Judaism has come to teach us and to teach the world. You know, much of my father's writings after the war, when he turns away from studies of medieval thought or of the Bible to his own theological writings in English, much of his writings has what is called a paratactic structure. Aphorisms, pitgamim, something that Theodor Adorno, the German philosopher, saw as mirroring the fragmentation of the world. But it's also that an aphorism is like a metaphor. It demands engagement and response. There may be different ways to interpret a metaphor, but we are asked by a metaphor to come in to the metaphor, to join. It's how a metaphor is different from a symbol. My father doesn't write arguments, that's not his style, it's not his goal. He isn't trying to convince us through arguments, but rather to encourage us to be open to new ways of thinking. Not just of thinking, but of new dimensions, of aspects of our lives that we sometimes neglect. A new way of thinking about the meaning of who I am. What is my purpose? What is my mandate? How can I leave this a better world than it was when I first arrived? What is my obligation? Because, in fact, for my father, that is the heart of being a Jew, not to submit to divine authority, not to submit to the absence of God, no, but to be engaged, to celebrate our lives, but to realize also that life is a mandate, not simply a gift, but a mandate, an obligation. I I was going to also talk to you a bit about my father's work in interfaith issues, but I think that the time is enough now for me to stop talking. But I do want to just say that here in Brazil, I think it would be especially interesting for many of you to read my father's essay, No Religion is an Island, which is a very unique approach to understanding our relations as Jews, especially with Christianity, but also with Islam. And when you do that, when you read that essay, I want you to look at the very end of the essay. The essay ends with a quotation from an 18th century Orthodox rabbi named Yaakov Emden, and then concludes with some of my father's own words. But please note that my father has the longest quote in that essay from this 18th century Orthodox rabbi, because he was so embracing of Christianity and Islam in his work, even more so than the liberal Jewish thinkers of the 19th and early 20th century. There's a richness my father's telling all of us. There's a richness to classical Jewish texts if we only pay attention and listen to what they have to say and bring them to the world. And I think that's what he felt was one of the important mandates of his own life. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
A gente vai passar agora para as perguntas, mas justamente por conta das intérpretes, eu vou pedir para quem quiser fazer uma pergunta da plateia, venha até aqui o microfone para poder fazer a pergunta e elas escutarem e ser traduzido para a professora Susannah Heschel. Então, eu vou começar aqui com a minha pergunta, essa oportunidade única aqui. Professora doutora Susannah Heschel, por volta dos anos 50, 60, 3 diferentes filósofos judeus usam a mesma imagem para falar da nossa época. Max Horkheimer escreve acerca do eclipse da razão. Poucos anos depois, Martin Buber, já no final da sua obra, escreve um livro cujo título é O Eclipse de Deus. E pouco tempo depois, Abraham Joshua Heschel, naquele magnífico livro Who is Man? Quem é o Homem?, fala em termos do eclipse da humanidade. Então essa imagem do eclipse, interessantemente, acontecendo em 3 pensadores logo após o Holocausto, talvez pegando 3 aspectos diferentes desse eclipse. O que eu gostaria de pedir é que você pudesse explicar um pouco mais o que é o eclipse da humanidade e essa urgência que Heschel sente em nossa época. E se isso continua.
Thank you, Rabbi Leone. It's a very interesting question, and I think the metaphor that's used of eclipse means that it is temporary, that it is not forever. An eclipse comes and an eclipse goes. But it's interesting to put the 3 together. Eclipse of reason, eclipse of God, eclipse of humanity. So Horkheimer, in the dialectic of enlightenment, feels that there is another element to the enlightenment than reason. There's also the element of the irrational, and that fascism was the triumph of the irrational over the rational. So it was an eclipse of reason. If reason were to come back and triumph, we would not have fascism. I think it's too simple. I think what we're seeing today around the world with the fascination with fascism, growing fascism, we see that it's more than an eclipse of reason. For Buber to say eclipse of God, my father rejected that because my father felt that putting responsibility on God is a kind of abdication of our moral responsibility. So the difference between saying God controls the world, and humans also have responsibility. My father would say, the question to ask is not, where was God that has such hubris, but to say, how does God continue to have faith in us, given how we behave? How can we even have hope for the future of humanity when we see throughout this world people being tortured? How does a person torture another human being? Before I came here, I read Bernardo Kuczynski's book, K. That book has changed my life. I will have all my students read that book. And I felt I'm coming to a country that is a swamp of blood. How can you kill your own children? I don't mean you understand, I'm talking about the dictatorship. How can they kill their own children like this? And Kuczynski writes there, you know, the Nazis wrote down the name of each person who came to a concentration camp. You can go to a memorial, you can go to Auschwitz. And here, they call it disappear, murder, disappear. No memorial, no name, no responsibility. No one wrote down a name. How can that be? How can people behave this way? So that's why my father said it's an eclipse of humanity. And he said eclipse because he had a little hope that it doesn't have to be that way.
You don't know how meaningful it is, not only for the time of dictatorship, but even for today in Brazil. It's not something that is historical. Who else?
Boa tarde, muito grande prazer. Eu gostaria de perguntar, ao longo da obra do seu pai, ele realiza diálogos e críticas com muitos sistemas de pensamento, pensadores contemporâneos e anteriores a ele, mas dificilmente seu pai cita o nome das pessoas com quem ele está dialogando. Por quê? Por quê?
What? Okay, yeah. This is true. He disagrees with the argument, but not with the human being. And I think he does this out of respect, and to say that his argument is not with a person. He disagrees with an idea. And I like that. I appreciate that. But I will say in his dissertation, it's different. Before the war, he was very clear in naming names in his dissertation. This scholar, that scholar said this and that. So it's different after the war. And maybe, I think, my father was so deeply affected that he felt he didn't want to say something bad about a human being. And so he didn't do that. But it's, I think, he also used to say, people get out of my work what they bring to it. people who know Heidegger know that his book, Who is Man, is a critique of Heidegger and of different social theorists. Those who don't know Heidegger, okay. Does it matter? No.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really inspiring. I'm curious about this idea of mandate, because the way I understand Judaism, it's more of a set of rules of conduct that tell you what to do in the micro decisions of life, what to do, what not to do, and then in the end of life, someone can say, you know, that was your impact. That's how you change the world or not. The idea of mandate, I think, I'm not a scholar on that, but I think more of Christianity, Protestantism, and Catholicism. Like people have missions or don't have missions. So I'm wondering, my question is how this idea of mandate clashes with the idea of the small micro-ethical decisions that we have to do, like go to Selma, not go to Selma. Go to the protest in Avenida Paulista, not go to the little things that we do that anyone can do, not only those who have this big mission. Like everyone confronts these micro daily decisions.
Thank you. So let me tell you about an argument my father had. During the Vietnam War, my father started an organization called Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam. And he started it because Seymour Melman, a professor at Columbia, had gathered material demonstrating the war crimes that the United States was committing. That this was no longer a war with a political purpose and military strategy. It was a war of daily crimes, of dropping bombs, of destroying land, of killing people. And that's what made my father decide he had to oppose the war. My father was not a pacifist, but this war was wrong. And during that period of time, so this is, by the way, a very intense period in my father's life, 1963 to 1968 in particular. But that year, 1965, was an extraordinary year for my father. It was the year he spent 2 months, we spent 2 months in Israel. My father was traveling and lecturing in Israel. It was the year he founded that anti-war organization. It was the year he gave the lecture, No Religion is an Island. It was the year that the Second Vatican Council issued Nostra Aetate. There was a lot in that year. But during that time, my father had an argument with Father Daniel Berrigan and his brother, who was also a priest, Philip Berrigan. They used to come to our home, especially Daniel Berrigan, for Shabbat dinner. And his argument, Berrigan's argument, was that my father should commit civil disobedience and go to prison as a symbolic gesture. And my father said that he could accomplish more by not being in prison, but by talking to people, by lecturing, by going to colleges, by trying to convince people, by writing. So the question for my father was, what is the goal? What is the purpose here? I want to end the war. How do I do that most effectively in my life? To write, to speak out, to talk to people. What should I do? That was how he decided. Selma, my father was pretty fragile. He had a weak heart. He couldn't go as a freedom rider on a, you know what that is, on a bus where people were being beaten, and so he couldn't survive it. And Selma was, at that moment, actually more of a celebration than a protest, because the President of the United States supported the march, and that was a major political moment. But how do we make these decisions, what to do? We have to think about clearly what is the goal we want to accomplish, what am I able to do to accomplish that goal. But I think there's also a question of our own conscience. What do I need to do? What do I need to do to be able to live with myself? What do I have to do? And, you know, I have to say, the last few years, I look at the people who go to the rallies with Donald Trump, and he engages in mockery. He makes fun of people. He makes fun of disabled people. He makes, it's racist and it's mockery, and the people cheer. They cheer the mockery. And they see they are destroying their own dignity. How will they ever recover it? I don't know. And I think that's something we need to worry about. Because without a sense of dignity, it's very difficult for us as human beings to repent, to create a better world, to have a sense of moral responsibility. Without dignity, how do we do that? So I'm very concerned about that. And I think, in other words, that there are marches, there are writing speeches, there are writing articles, speaking out to friends, but there are also subtle ways, subtle things like dignity that we have to be attentive to. And we need to ask ourselves right now, this will come to an end at some point, but how will we recover? The Germans after 1945 had the same problem, how to recover a moral compass after what they did. And that was the 1950s. How can they possibly find their ethical footing again? The ministers asked, but so did the politicians. How do we become an ethical country where people will respect us? And I say that about the United States. How can we once again become an ethical country where people will respect us? How will we regain our dignity? And I think we should start worrying about that now. And it's very much a religious question. We should be asking our religious leaders, give us help, give us advice, what to do.
Queria agradecer e perguntar, uma conversa que eu tive recentemente com alunos sobre o texto da Declaração Universal dos Direitos Humanos e pensar como no momento em que ela aparece, a filosofia do seu pai se coloca em relação a pensar que se propunha como um documento universal, como um conjunto de princípios, ao mesmo tempo em que se vivenciava no mesmo país, por exemplo, as leis raciais que ainda distinguiam os acessos civis da própria população norte-americana. Então eu queria ouvir um pouco como, no conjunto desse movimento, essa oposição entre uma tentativa de um acordo político que teria uma dimensão universalizante se contrapunha imediatamente à realidade do dia a dia das próprias leis do país. Foi uma pergunta de um aluno e eu acho que foi uma conversa que começou por um caminho interessante sobre a efetividade do que seria Kavaná mesmo, né? Do que seria as intenções de concretizar algo que vai além de um papel e de um conjunto de princípios, mas que pode ser visto como uma realidade a ser implementada e é um norte verdadeiro ao ser buscado dentro de uma sociedade. Eu queria saber um pouco como o Rabino Heschel se relacionava com esse tema, se ele chegou a se relacionar com esse tema, escrever sobre isso, posição.
Yeah, so the United States didn't want to sign the Universal Declaration on Human Rights because they said then they'll come after the United States for our racism, our Jim Crow laws. And that's exactly the problem. And in the United States, there is a political movement of contempt for the United Nations, which I think we see in other countries as well. And a sense that there is no universal human. Yeah. So, of course, that was anathema to my father. I said earlier, Mayor Kahana said, never again to the Jews. My father said, never again to anyone. It was universal. I know my father would be very upset by the politicians who are rising today in Israel, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who may end up with 15 seats in the Knesset. My father would be appalled by that. There is Jewish racism also, and that's something we have not paid enough attention to. At least I see in my colleagues, my friends in the United States. Racism in Jewish texts, including some of the texts that I otherwise love. In Hasidic texts and Kabbalistic texts, it's there. We all have this. We also have contempt for women. The dignity of women is not valued the same as the dignity of men, and the rights of women, and the lives of women. There are aspects of the Torah that I think would count as criminal. Sota is one passage, for instance. Sexual assault. So, that sense of the universal, the human universal, seems to be something new in Jewish thought, classical Jewish thought, but I think there are also intimations of it, which is why I mentioned Yaakov Emden, for instance. And I think that's something that my father brings out, certainly in his book, Who is Man, but elsewhere. Judaism is not unified. There are different views, and my father doesn't try to reconcile them. He says there's this view and there's this view. Different understandings of revelation, for example. They coexist. But I think we have an innate moral conscience, and we know what's right and what's wrong. And the idea that some human beings are more precious to God than others is a denial of God. My father was very clear about that.
Professor Heschel, thanks for exploring the legacy of your father. My question is, in my country, like in yours, the Christian right uses politics to defend ideas clearly contrary to human values. My question is, how did your father construct such a humanitarian religious philosophy in a time when political theology was associated with Carl Schmitt and with this really negative ideas of religion?
So you're asking several things, and they're all important, and they deserve more than a simple, quick answer. You know, by the way, that Carl Schmitt was very close to certain Christian leaders who supported Hitler, by the way. And of course my father thought that was horrible. What can I say? It's clear. But I think the larger question that you're asking is really, what would my father say to these evangelical leaders? How would he speak to them? And how would we respond to them and to the people who were attracted to them? That's really what you're asking, no? So what would he say? You know, first of all, let me say my father was a very gentle person. My father never talked to Christians about anti-Semitism. It wasn't necessary. When I was a child, my father often had visitors from the Vatican or from the Union Theological Seminary. Christians would come to our home for Shabbat dinner or for a Passover Seder. And in those days, it was very unusual. It was the first time. Catholics were told in America in the 50s not to socialize with anyone who was not a Catholic. For a nun and a priest to come to our home wearing religious clothing for Shabbat dinner, to come into our home and to see my father at the table pray. I could tell they were transformed by the moment. They suddenly realized that you couldn't say, this person is not going to go to heaven. They suddenly realized that as Christians, they had something to learn about God from a Jew. And it was 2,000 years since they felt that way. 2,000 years. So maybe what my father in those moments was doing was simply being a religious Jew and allowing Christians to experience Judaism at its most holy moments and have a chance to be transformed. I don't know if everyone would react like that, but I think that my father felt that we as Jews shouldn't be ashamed of being Jewish, as many were in America, that we shouldn't try to hide or live in a ghetto world, that people have something to learn about God from Jews, and maybe we can help them. And maybe that is part of our mandate today. So I think sometimes there is a longing among some of the evangelical Christians that I have experienced. I lived, for example, in Dallas, Texas for 3 years. I went to Israel every summer to recuperate. But I felt that they wanted more from their Christianity than going to church on Sunday for 1 hour. And they didn't know how to do it. They didn't know what we know, which is that Judaism is every day. And it's in our home and not just in the synagogue. That we have a language, Hebrew. That we have customs, that we have an ethnicity. That we have little phrases we say, like Baruch Hashem and Good Shabbos and things like that. I think Christian evangelicals want to ethnicize Christianity. I think they have shtetl envy. I think they would like to be more like Judaism. And I think that might be one way of trying to say to them, look, you can have this without being right-wing politically. That is, without damning other people, without saying we're good and they're bad, without saying either you're a friend or an enemy like Schmidt. I think we can show it to them. And I think that they do long for that. So I say this because I do have some hope, even when I see people who are against everything I stand for. Still, I think we can't give up. And maybe there is a way of showing them that it's possible. Look, we as Jews, we have what they want. Community, we have ethnicity, we have everything that they want too. And we can embrace the whole world and not have that Schmittian friend-enemy. So that's just a small bit of a response on a very practical level. Thanks.
Hi, Professor. It's such a pleasure to have you here and your insights about your father. As you know, there are many understandings about revelation in Judaism. I would like to ask you, what is your father's understanding about that?
Revelation. So my father wrote a great deal about revelation. And one of the points that he makes in God in Search of Man and also in Torah and Shemayim, he says simply there's a way of understanding revelation in terms of the words spoken, the Torah, or as an experience. So we know that the rabbis took Shir Shirim, the Song of Songs, and they said it's an allegory of what happened at Mount Sinai. So in the Song of Songs it says, Yishakeni Menashikot Pihu, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. What does that mean? It means that every soul stood at Mount Sinai, and God came to every soul and gave a kiss. And each soul experienced this kiss in a unique way, because everybody is unique. And so my father says it's an experience, Mount Sinai, and it's a unique experience that each person has. And we take that experience and give it expression. And the question is, a challenge for us, how many people do we allow to express? Everybody or only men? And some men. But I think what was... So my father understood that actually it's not one or the other, that either it's Torah or it's experience, but rather the two coexist. And we can't have just one without the other. We can't have too much emphasis just on the law, or we become what he called religious behaviorists. We can't have Judaism just be a series of laws, and we can't just have experience, because that too would be an abdication and a kind of submission, as I mentioned earlier, a submission to law. No, it has to be an engagement. So it's about balance, and throughout his writings, my father's always talking about balance. There's some of this, and we need a bit of both. And each person has a slightly different balance, perhaps, but to have one without the other leads us into chaos, or abyss even. But I would just say the best thing is to read his discussion of revelation and God in Search of Man. That's my suggestion.
First of all, to be here and listen to your very insightful speech about your father. I'd like to ask you two questions. One question is, what role did Yiddish play in your family life? Because I'm very interested in the Yiddish Schreiber and the Yiddish writer aspect of your father's life and work. And I would also like to know, how did your father view the decline of Yiddish and the matzav, the situation of Yiddish towards the end of his life? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. So my father grew up speaking Yiddish as a child, of course, and he wrote his last book in Yiddish on the Kotzker. My father's family, some of my father's family managed to get out of Europe before the war. If they didn't, whoever didn't get out before the war was killed, but a few got out, including my father's sister. My father was 3 years old when his sister got married. She was 17, and she married a cousin, the Kapitschnitzer Rebbe, and they moved to Vienna, and they got out of Vienna just before the war, and they came to New York City. So my father had his sister, my father had a brother who also got out and was in England. But with the family, my father's sister only spoke Yiddish. And my father's cousin, brother-in-law, my uncle, also only spoke Yiddish. So certainly when we were family, it was only Yiddish.
Do you speak Yiddish?
And so I've said, we'll talk about it later. It confuses with my German. And I have to say, it's really a remarkable thing that my father wrote books in 4 languages. Not many people. But so there was that aspect. The Yiddish of the religious world, of the Haredi world, the Hasidic world. Then my father was friendly with some Yiddish writers. Chaim Grada was a friend, a good friend. And there were others as well. Hillel Zeidman, you might know, was also a friend. His daughter's my friend. He was a journalist. Gershon Jacobson, who wrote for a Yiddish newspaper, was another good friend. So there were friends of my father's who would come to our home and would speak Yiddish at home. In terms of a decline, yes, my father was concerned about the way that Hebrew was becoming more important than Yiddish, and he felt that Yiddish was nonetheless an extremely important language, which is why he wrote about the Kotzker in Yiddish, because there's some things you can only say in Yiddish. And maybe there were some things that my father could only talk about in Yiddish. Just as I think is true for everybody, there's some things when you speak more than one language, there's some ideas, some words, some things you only feel you can say in that language and not in the other. My father never used the word Holocaust like that, or Shoah. He talked about what happened during the war. And he didn't address it directly very often, only occasionally. And when he did, it was in Yiddish. So of course, we can ask ourselves, why did he choose this language versus that language for certain books, certain ideas? After the war, my father never again wrote in German and would never go to Germany, even though he was invited. Yeah.
Adam.
Did he write poetry in English?
No.
Only in Yiddish?
And that was when he was actually in Vilna with a group of Yiddish poets, the Young Vilna group. Chaim Grada, Sutzkever, a few others were there. And that was a small book that he published with a dedication to his father. And he was often very, he felt shy about those poems. He didn't want them republished, he didn't want them translated. Because he was very young then. And I think it's common to many of us when we look back at something we wrote when we were very young. Yes. He was, we often feel a little embarrassed. I wrote that, I was 19. Yes.
Sim, em nome do Centro de Estudos Judaicos da USP, queria agradecer muitíssimo a brilhante e instigante conferência. E a minha pergunta é, seu pai, com essa visão de mundo universalista, o que ele pensava da ortodoxia contemporânea a ele, que tem essa visão tão particularista em relação aos judeus, e o que ele pensava desses pensadores ortodoxos ou rabinos ortodoxos?
Thank you. One thing just occurs to me to mention in response to the previous question. Elie Wiesel, before he got married, lived in our neighborhood and was a good friend and used to come over on Shabbat afternoon and take a walk with my father, and then they would have tea. And with my father, they also spoke, he spoke Yiddish. They spoke Yiddish together. So that was another person. But at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and among Jewish studies academics, Yiddish was held in contempt. And so was Kabbalah, Hasidism. I was told as a child, half joking, say Shabbat Shalom to the professors, don't say Good Shabbos. And if I said Good Shabbos, they would say Shabbat Shalom. And it was almost as if it was anti-Zionist to say Yiddish. But to treat Yiddish that way was also terrible. It's a shanda. It's a shame. So what would my father say about contemporary orthodoxy? In my father's lifetime, he was criticized by Orthodox rabbis, especially when he became involved in the Second Vatican Council and ecumenical efforts. Now, Joseph Soloveitchik wrote an article called Confrontation that appeared in the journal Tradition that doesn't mention my father by name but is attacking him and says we cannot talk theology with Christians. Reuven Kimmelman, who was a student of my father's, wrote an article in which he says, actually, what Soloveitchik says and what my father says, really the same thing. My father wasn't trying to discuss theology with the church. He wasn't talking to the church about their understanding of incarnation or Jesus and so forth. He didn't do that. My father, in contrast to all other modern Jewish thinkers, my father does not write about Jesus or about Paul. He doesn't. That's what all the modern Jewish thinkers love to write about. Jesus was the Jew, a good Jew, a pious Jew, and Paul started the religion Christianity. That, you hear that everywhere. My father didn't do that. So in fact, was Soloveitchik really disagreeing with my father, or was he trying to write something that would make Orthodox people feel that we're a little different? All right. Norman Lamb was a major Orthodox rabbi in New York who became the president of Yeshiva University later. And he also attacked any Jew who sits and talks to the Vatican. He said was just like Esau kissed Jacob in the Bible. And the rabbis say he didn't really kiss, he actually tried to kill. He attacked. Esau attacked Jacob. It looked like a kiss, but it wasn't. And that's what Lamb said, Rabbi Lamb said. My father, any Jew talking to the Catholic Church, it looks like the Catholic Church is being friendly, but really they just want to destroy us. It's a very strong statement. And then there were Jews who wrote in the Jewish newspapers saying that my father shouldn't go to the Vatican. If the Pope wants to talk to him, let the Pope come to him. Very arrogant. And my father said, if going to Rome can help save a Jew, one Jewish life, it's worth it. Where my father drew the line very clearly was about mission, missionary work. He said to try to convert Jews to Christianity is spiritual fratricide. He said, I'd rather go to Auschwitz than give up my faith, which was very hard for me to hear as a child. So his engagement with Christians was profound, and they were actually filled with respect for him. My father had many, many serious, deep friendships in the Christian world, very important friendships. Not just with the Berrigan brothers, of course, with Sister Mary Carita, whom you met, the artist, and with William Sloane Coffin, who was the chaplain at Yale University, with the faculty at Union Theological Seminary, the president, John Bennett, a New Testament scholar, W.D. Davies, was a very close friend. And you know what? Professor Davies wrote a very important book called Paul and Rabbinic Theology. He came from a village in Wales, and he went to study in Cambridge, and there he met David Dauba, who was an Orthodox Jewish refugee from Germany, who taught Davies something about the Talmud. And Davies then saw the parallels between rabbinic thought and the epistles of St. Paul. And he wrote a book about it, the first one. Amazing book, Breakthrough, one of the major books. The late 1940s it was published. And Davies, Professor Davies told me privately once, he said that my father was the only Jewish scholar that he talked to who was not patronizing toward him. He would go to Jewish scholars and they would say, oh, you know, you're a Christian, what would you know about rabbinic thought? And they would talk down to him. My father didn't do that. But he was in some sense a bridge. And he was, of course, respectful of Christian thinkers. And my father knew a lot about Christianity. I have notebooks in which my father took notes in his handwriting in little notebooks from reading classical Christian thought. My father also, you know, read Arabic. And so in his articles on medieval Jewish philosophers, he quotes Arabic sources. He studied very hard. He knew so much. But his interest was profound and important. You know? What would he say about the Orthodox? He would say that they're living in a ghetto. He would say that they're obsessed with Shulchan Aruch, with religious behaviorism. And what do I do? On Shabbat, can I gather the crumbs on the tablecloth? Is it permitted on Shabbat? Where's the atmosphere? Where's the Shabbat atmosphere? If you're constantly worried, oh yeah, I accidentally touched the candlestick and it's muktzah. You know, where is the atmosphere that we want to create? And in that sense, I think sometimes there's a parallel with the Christian evangelicals. They do long for something, but sometimes they don't know how to get there. And they get there in the wrong path because they're led in the wrong direction. Yeah, okay. And I say that as someone who belongs to an Orthodox synagogue, by the way.
Thank you, Professor Heschel. Could you please share with us some thoughts from your father on the interfaith dialogue and cooperation, and if he had any relations to any institution of interfaith cooperation, please? Thank you very much.
Sure. So, thank you for the question, the interfaith. So my father used to say that interfaith has to begin with faith. What is my faith? Do I know what my faith is? So, my father used to say the problem with interfaith is that too often the people who participate don't really know their own religion. So how can they begin to talk to others? He said sometimes, well, maybe you know, in this book, Moral Grandeur, there's an essay that begins with a funny story. My father says he was invited once to a conference to speak about God and Judaism. And he agreed, and then he got the program. And the program had the title of his lecture, The Idea of God in Judaism. God is not an idea. I had this experience myself when I was a graduate student, and a professor in class kept talking about the God idea. You know, I'm not an idea either. I'm a person. I'm alive, I'm present, I'm here. And God is not just some idea. And once God becomes an idea, my father says, that's not faith anymore. So that was very important for my father to make that point. You know, my father says in Torah Shemayim, one of the main themes is, how do you make the transcendent immanent and the immanent transcendent? So how do you make the transcendent immanent? So God is transcendent, but how can you feel God's presence everywhere? How do you make God present when God is so remote and so transcendent? And so too, if God is for us feels imminent. You know, my father used to joke about the Protestant theologian Paul Tillich, and so did Martin Luther King, who was another good friend. And my father, Tillich said, God is the ground of being. My father said, okay, so he's a ground of being, so fine, let him be the ground of being. Doesn't do anything, I'm not for, I'm not against, what does it matter? It doesn't mean anything. There's no command. There's no obligation. Ground of being, what does that mean? You don't march in Selma for a ground of being. You don't scream against the war in Vietnam for a ground of being. The prophets are not screaming in agony on behalf of the poor and the suffering. Ground of being, I don't think, will stop people torturing other human beings. What is it that keeps people from feeling themselves the agony of other human beings? That's the question. So, with interfaith too, if God has to command too, I want this to be a better world. I want this to be a world of justice. How do I make God's immanence transcendent? So my father always said, these are questions that face all human beings of all religions. And those are the kinds of questions we should talk about. What religious resources do we have to stop torture? It doesn't matter what our particular religion says. That's not the point. More important is, what questions do we ask as religious people? There's so much talk these days about leadership. I see all the time, I have 2 children, and there are all kinds of programs that come through. Send your children to this camp, or this program, we train leaders. And I keep thinking what my father would say, he would be appalled. What leaders? It's principles. It's principles, moral principles. That's what you want. What's a leader? If a leader, you know, Bolsonaro's also a leader, no? Trump. So my father felt this is what interfaith really should focus on. And he says in his one article after another in this piece, No Religion is an Island, what do we do in moments of despair? We all have despair as religious people. And how do we support each other in those moments? I just say one last thing. There's a prayer in the Shemona Esrei, in the major prayer in Judaism, where we speak of God resurrecting the dead. And you know, a lot of well-meaning liberal Jews say, I don't believe that the dead will be resurrected, including Sadia, who was not a liberal medieval philosopher. Okay. And so in some Reformed prayer books, they change it. Instead of God resurrects the dead, it says God resurrects everything, all. It's a call, no? Not the Mechaimis. Mechayak. And I think from my father, prayers aren't supposed to describe the world as it is, but to give expression to hope, to longing, to wishes. What could we want more than anything when someone we love dies, that they should come back to life? It's what we want. Prayer is an opportunity to speak in terms of hope and wish and longing. And that's why prayer, my father says, is the home for the soul. So I think interfaith for my father was about that. Where are our hopes and our wishes and our longings that we all share? we can focus on. And that's what should go on in synagogues and in churches. Let's speak of our longing that this should be a world of justice. There should be no torture. There should be no poverty. There should be no racism. We long for that. We long for that for others and for ourselves. And because we can't possibly live a full human life when other people are suffering. So I think that's what interfaith should be for my father.
Thank you so much for that coming here.
Thank you.
We are very honored.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm so happy that you made this conference. It's wonderful to meet everyone. And I think Brazil is an extraordinary place. And the fact that you are so interested in my father, Jews and Christians here, I think that's really extraordinary. It would make my father so happy. I wish I could phone him and tell him. You can't imagine this community here in Brazil, and he would be so happy.